He was the only composer ever elected to the Royal Yacht Squadron. Yes, there is a Royal Yacht Squadron, and yes, it is the most British thing I've heard in a very long time. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Sir Hubert Parry. Hubert Parry was born in February 1848 into a well-to-do English family. His father was a painter. In fact, he had invented a process by which frescoes could be painted, and was also an amateur pianist and hornist. His mother, however, died less than 2 weeks after giving birth to him, and she died from tuberculosis, which meant that she went through childbirth hacking up a lung and survived, at least for a little while afterwards. Hubert, along with his brother and sister, were always at the bottom of the proverbial totem pole in relation to their step-siblings. Despite the family's overall musicality, as his brother picked up the cello, music was not really seen as a profession. It was seen more as a hobby. But while at prep school, Parry first became entranced with the organ music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and was first exposed to the great British choral tradition. Family trouble loomed, and Hubert's budding musical interests were the least of his disapproving father's concerns. His brother was thrice kicked out of Oxford for his opium addiction and the subsequent laziness that entailed, and his sister also died of tuberculosis as his mother had. He soon decided that he was not going to suffer the same fate as either of his siblings. At this point, Parry was at Eton College, but Eton really didn't have a music program to speak of, so he had to take lessons in the nearby town of Windsor. At this point in history, England was known as the land without music, which is not entirely fair. They did have music. The problem is they didn't have any composers of international renown since the death of Henry Purcell, and he died in the late 1600s. Parry's training was rigorous in the compositional basics, which was really good for him, and he decided that he would do what his brother couldn't, and get into Oxford, and then actually graduate, because, his brother did get in, he just got kicked out because of his opium addiction. Don't do drugs, kids. His compositional chops grew, and his early exposure to choral music was a really big asset. He did end up making it into Oxford, but he went along with his father's wishes and didn't actually study music there. He studied law instead, which his father believed made for a more seemly and suitable career. But nothing could take Parry's mind off of music, and he even studied abroad in Stuttgart for a while, slowly expanding the modernity of his influences. For a long time he was a big fan of Schumann and Brahms, but during this period he was first exposed to the works of Richard Wagner. Not being German himself, he didn't feel pressured to come down on one side or the other of the great Brahms versus Wagner debate. He was free to pull from both influences in the way that he wanted to. He did still have to lead a double life as far as career was concerned. In order to keep his father from going ballistic, he had to work at Lloyd's of London. While he didn't like it, the steady and non-musical job he held also helped his romantic prospects, as he married in 1872 into a family of the lower nobility. Eventually, as he continued writing music, he was able to move squarely into the profession of professional composer. Big shoes to fill, but not quite as big as they may have been in other countries. There was competition, just not as much of it. He got his doctorate at Cambridge in 1883 and began teaching at Oxford the following year. His break came fast, as his choral music was noticed by Charles Villiers Stanford, one of the most prominent composers and composition professors living and working in England at the time. It didn't take long before Parry was the choral composer to go to, which he didn't actually like all that much. He didn't like just churning out oratorio after oratorio, yet it seemed like every commission he got was for some oratorio. His lack of enthusiasm for the genre was evident to some contemporary critics, and the composer Frederick Delius was amazed that someone so rich could ever think that he could write so convincingly about the Book of Job. His reputation is still primarily in choral music, although his purely instrumental music is no less impressive an output. So why did Parry not like the oratorio? Well, in addition to the continual commissions he got for them, something that would wear down on even the most enthusiastic of oratorio composers, the oratorio was also a religiously inspired genre. It was invented in the mid-1600s when the opera houses were closed during the season of Lent, but they wanted to put on productions anyway. So they invented the oratorio, which was an unstaged opera, which was based on biblical themes. And Parry was never super religious. In fact, his The last choral pieces are intended to secularize the oratorio. It's one of the first attempts to do so. He called these 6 pieces his ethical cantatas, and they never really made it into the repertoire, although he was a little bit ahead of his time. After his death and into the 20th century, there were some secular oratorios, more and more of them, but these were never really a large part of the oratorio genre. Most oratorios, even nowadays, are religiously inspired, or at the very least spiritual, if not drawing from an actual biblical source. Because of all the oratorios he wrote, Parry's name is ascribed to several popular hymn tunes, which were drawn from either these or some of his later compositions. In the last half-decade of the 19th century, Parry took over as the director of the Royal College of Music. Critics would point to this as a mistake on his part because it took 5 years off of his compositional career. It took so much time just running the day-to-day administrative duties that he had almost no time to write his own pieces, and this was at the height of his powers. He only fully retired from his teaching duties in 1908 when the doctors told him that it would be best for his health. And specifically, they told him that he needed to recuperate in Sicily, and who's going to say no to that? In 1918, when one of the worst flu pandemics gripped the world, Parry was one of the over 500 million worldwide affected. As it turns out, swine flu was just too much for his 70-year-old frame to handle, and he died in October of that year. He was, for all of his wealth, profoundly anti-conservative, and his sympathies lay with the early women's suffrage and feminist movements. He held optimistic, if not outright utopian, views on European peace, which were shattered when World War I raged, sweeping up many of his most promising students into its fire and fury. This was specifically troubling for him because he was such an admirer of the Germanic tradition, specifically the German symphonic tradition, and he modeled his 5 symphonies on Germanic models. But it's not fair to call his symphonic output merely a Germanic ripoff. They have the seeds of what would become a full-fledged British symphonic tradition to be found in the composers of the next generation. He wrote chamber music, but he was never known for it as much as he was for his larger-scale works. And it doesn't help that a large portion of his chamber output was published well after his death. There seems to have been a general lack of interest in Parry chamber music in his lifetime. Interestingly, for all of his choral works and all of his songs, there is only one opera in his entire collected work. Parry was not only considered one of the greatest English composers since Henry Purcell, but was also at the inception of 2 pillars of the musical world, the Royal College of Music and the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. He contributed over 100 articles to the first edition of the Grove Dictionary, cementing his place as a musicologist in addition to his work as a composition professor and a composer. Though detractors thought that the term English musical renaissance was a showy term from an insulated group of composers who liked and promoted each other's works, a group that included Parry and Stanford and a few others, it is true that without them, and without Parry's circle, you don't have composers like the Gustav Holsts of the world, you don't have the Ralph Vaughan Williams of the world, you don't have the Frank Bridges of the world. He and his compatriots clearly had a hand in bringing British musical culture back, and making the land without music a thing of the past. He set the stage for composers to continue to exemplify Britain through music, and his music has a distinct Englishness about it. Holst was glad that Parry wasn't scary to talk to, perhaps a veiled reference to Stanford and his notoriously terrifying lessons. Parry also helped fund an experimental radium-based treatment for his student Herbert Howells, who was suffering from the then incurable thyroid condition known as Graves' disease. This treatment worked, and he ended up living a very long life. Vaughan Williams praised Parry for his impartiality as a professor, as he had the ability to push aside his own beliefs and convictions when judging the work of another, even though his modern reputation rests on just a small number of pieces. Without him, this pivotal moment in British musical history would be very different.